Good afternoon, boys and girls. Welcome back to Hospitality Studies. My name is Mpumi Zulu, and today we'll be learning about meat. Meat is quite a lengthy section and holds a considerable amount of marks in the question paper. So brace yourselves, have your pen and paper ready to write some notes. Now, you might be wondering, what is meat? Meat is the edible part of the carcass besides the skin as well as the bones. Now, with every food commodity, we will be discussing the nutritional value of the commodity. Now, meat, as you learned in grade 10, forms part of the meat and meat alternatives. And meat is very, very important in your daily diet because it contains proteins. Now, meat has got all the essential amino acids. Meat also has vitamins. In particular, in the muscle of the meat, it is vitamin B12, and then in the fat, it is your vitamin A and vitamin D. It has got a limited amount of carbohydrates, and as much as fat must be consumed in small quantities, the fat in the meat is beneficial because it adds to the flavor as well as the tenderness and the juiciness of the meat. When we discuss meat, we'll discuss meat under the following. It is beef, lamb or mutton, pork, game or venison, as well as offal. We will start off with game. Game is the hunted birds, the wild animals, and the water animals. So it is all very rare, or we call it a delicacy. It is not a type of meat that we consume on a daily basis. It is really a very rare delicacy. Now, meat is further categorized, or game is further categorized into three categories: your furred game, your feathered game, as well as your aquatic game. Now, you are not required to know what each and every game meat looks like I'll discuss with you in the following slides. You should know the different types so that if you are asked in a question to replace a certain meat cut, whether it's from beef or lamb, with a feathered or a furred game, you are able to do so. So our feathered game is all the game that has feathers. Your furred game is all your game that has got fur, and then your aquatic game is all your game that comes from the water, and there's only one example. I'm going to illustrate to you the different types of feathered game first. It is, for example, your ducks, guinea fowls, pigeons, quails, partridges, pheasants, ducks, ostrich, and emu. All of them have got feathers. Your third game will be, for example, your wild pig or boar, your kudu, your kangaroo, your rabbit, impala, blesbok, and porcupine. It's all got fur. Your aquatic game, like I said, is only one example, and that is your crocodile. So you will consume the crocodile meat from it, not the skin. Now, game is a very lean and very dry piece of meat, and therefore, it needs to be consumed. And for it to be consumed, the best technique to apply to the game is barding. You learned about barding in grade 11, and you know that barding is when you cover a piece of meat with fat, especially bacon. And you do that for many reasons. Like I just said now, that it is a very dry, very lean meat, which means that there's very little fat in game. So when you apply the technique barding to the game, it prevents it from being dry. It makes it moist, which makes it very juicy and nicely and edible. It adds flavor because of the smokiness of the bacon, and also improves the appearance because you do not remove the bacon after baking. You leave it there so it improves the look of the game or the piece of meat. Our next meat is our offal. Now, offal is our edible organs and the intestines of an animal. Now, in grade 12, as much as there are many different types of offal, we only focus on the three: our liver, our kidneys, as well as our tongue. Now, when we I've given you pictures here so you can basically see what each of them look like. Again, you will never be given a picture to identify of an offal, but it might be in a scenario based question, in a menu where you will be asked to talk about the different types of offal. Now, our liver, you can get ox liver or liver from a calf, and basically what is very important here is that you need to remove the membrane on the liver before you fry it. You can pan fry, you can saute it. And then the liver from pork or goose can be used in patés. So you get your goose liver paté, which is also what you've learned in your cocktail functions in term 1. Your kidneys, you can get kidneys from lamb, which you'll slice, you can grill them and you can fry them. And then from the beef, you can make chicken liver, mistaken kidney pie, or you can have it in a kidney stew. And then your tongue, you can purchase tongue fresh, you can purchase it cured, especially for Christmas. A lot of people purchase it cured and smoked, and then once it's cooked, you can either serve it cold, sliced, it can go in a salad, etc. Now, there are many factors or certain factors that influence the quality of meat before the meat is slaughtered and then after the meat is slaughtered. So we call it the pre-mortem, which is before it is slaughtered, or the post-mortem phenomenal, which is after the meat is slaughtered. Now, before the meat is slaughtered, feeding of the meat is very, very important, of the animal. It is very, very important because it influences the quality of the meat. If the animal is fed well, then that means that meat is going to be juicy, the meat is going to be tender, and it's going to be much more nicer. Marbling, the marbling in the meat. Marbling is the intramuscular fat. It is all the fats that you find in the muscle of the meat. When the meat is well fed, it's going to have a lot of marbling. Now, marbling will contribute to the tenderness and the flavorness of the meat. Okay? The age, the younger the animal, the tender it is. The older the animal, the tougher it is. Muscular activity. If the animal uses a lot of muscular activity, so moves around a lot, it will be less tender than a younger animal. It will be more tender. And then the treatment in the meat. The treatment, it is very important that meat becomes stress-free. So the animal does not go through a lot of stress before it is slaughtered. Because if the animal goes through a lot of stress before it is slaughtered, it will essentially be tough because the muscles will shrink and it will become tough. So the animal needs to be kept as calm as possible before it is slaughtered to so that it becomes nice and tender. Your post-mortem, your after death or after slaughtering, meat can go through cold shrinkage. Okay, if you rapidly cool the carcass, this is the rapid cooling of the carcass. It will cause cold shrinkage. This means that the muscles will contract and the meat will not become tender. Electrical stimulation is better on the meat because now what happens is as much as the meat is cooled down, but it does not cause shrinkage because of the stimulation. Rigor mortis is the after death process that occurs on the meat. These are all the biochemical changes that take place within the muscle fibers. Okay, it can cause the muscles to contract and also it can make them to be stiffened and tough. Ripening, we call it ripening or maturing or aging of the meat. This is now a process that only takes place after you've had your rigor mortis. It is a natural process and it contributes to the tenderness of the meat. And in the cooking process, this is basically what cooking methods have you applied to meats that will influence the tenderness of the meat. If you apply the wrong cooking method to the meat might become tough and not become desirable. Okay, because heat can cause meat to become tough and dry. The quality characteristics or the characteristics of quality meat. When you buy beef, you need to make sure that it is bright red to cherry red. The texture must be firm, it must not be dry. The fat must be evenly distributed throughout the meat. The bones must be red and porous. Lamb must be bright to light red. It must have a smooth, fine grain. It must have a texture that is firm and it must not be dry. The fat must be evenly distributed. The bones must be soft, red, and porous. With pork, it must have a grayish pink color. It must have a firm texture. It must not leave a dent when you press it, because the moment it leaves a dent, it means that it is not fresh. The fat must be a creamy white color. Boys and girls, we will look at the classification of red meat. This is mostly for consumers. Each and every piece of meat has got a classification. It's normally stamped on the outside fat of the meat, and this tells you about the quality of the meat. Is it a young animal? Is it an older animal? Does it have a lot of fat? Does it have little fat? Etc. etc. So basically, it tells you about the quality of the meats, and it is graded according to colors as well, as you can see there. It is not important for you to memorize the classification, but you basically need to know that, for example, A means it is a very young animal, and then your C means that it is a very old animal. Remember what I said in the beginning: the younger the animal, the more tender the meat; the older the animal, the more tougher the meat. Okay, so that is very important. But you will never be asked to grade the meat, this will form part of application, where they will tell you that, for example, you're buying an A grade meat or an AB grade. Evaluate the tenderness and the quality of the meat, and hence you would say what I just mentioned now before. When you've purchased the meat, it goes through, you have to store it at the right temperatures. Meat can either be frozen or it can be refrigerated. When you're refrigerating meat, it must be at -1 degrees Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius. And when you freeze it, it must be at -18 to -45 degrees Celsius. That is very important, because that will determine the shelf life of the meat as well. Because if you don't freeze your meat and you place your meat in the freezer, it is going to be highly perishable and it's going to be a waste of money. Meat can also be vacuum packaged. Vacuum packaging means that you are extracting all the air, so you seal it into a plastic bag and you remove all the oxygen from the meat, and then you can freeze it. Now, this also helps when you are placing the meats in the freezer. It saves space because you can put one package on top of the other. Now, what's very interesting about vacuum packaging is that once you remove all the oxygen, the meat has a funny color, and a person can mistake that and say that the meat is off, or some people can say it's rotten. That is because there is an absence of oxygen. Once you open the packaging, when you are ready to prepare the meat and all the oxygen goes back into the meat, the colors that we've discussed in the previous slide, that the beef will become a very bright red color, and if it is lamb, it will become a cherry color. Okay. Freezer burn: if you place meat in the freezer without covering it up in plastic, the meat will get what we call freezer burn. That is when the coldness starts eating off on the meat, and the meat then ends up having an undesirable color and can sometimes not be edible because now it's burnt, and it can become chewy and definitely undesirable, and it will not have a lot of sarcoplasm, so which is not essentially now good. Now, thawing: when you take meat out of a freezer, you need to thaw it properly to retain the sarcoplasm, because now remember, sarcoplasm has got all the nutrients, and you cannot afford to lose any sarcoplasm. So, for example, when you remove meat from the freezer, you can thaw the meat in the refrigerator. So, you take it out and you place it onto a container, and you place it on the bottom shelf of the refrigerator and not on the top, because all the sarcoplasm can drip into other food, and then you have a case of cross contamination between your cooked food and your raw food. So it is better to leave it onto the bottom shelf in the refrigerator to defrost overnight, or to lose the ice overnight. Or you can now use the more conventional methods, where you place the meat and you thaw it into the microwave. But under no circumstances do you place the meat in water and try and thaw it in water, because all the sarcoplasm and all the nutrients will get washed away in that water. And you also do not thaw the meat out in the sun, because outside in the sun there's a lot of bacteria, and we know that bacteria needs warmth to grow, and then a person might be sick with the previous lessons, infectious disease. So you try and avoid that as much as possible. Okay. Meat undergoes different preparation methods, and these are very good because they don't only improve on the juiciness, but also on the flavor, on the appearance of the meat. Some of the preparation methods can stretch the meat so it can serve large amounts of people. We've already discussed barding, so I'm not going to discuss it again, but it is part of preparation methods. Basting is when you are brushing the meat with you can brush it with the with some oil or some spices, and throughout the cooking process you can baste it. It improves the appearance, it makes it all nice and glossy, the juiciness, the tenderness of the meat, especially if you've marinated the meat prior. Carving: this is when you use a fork and a carving knife to make different portions, equal portions amongst your guests. Larding. Larding is when you insert pieces of vegetables or fat, in this instance in the meat, using a larding needle. Okay, so you are sewing, or you are putting in fat into the muscle of the meat, which will essentially make it so nice and tender, and also juicy as well. Marinating is when you steep the meat into a mixture. Normally there's an acid and there are spices. It makes the meat tender, it makes the meat juicy, and also it definitely improves the appearance of the meat as well. Searing is when you basically, when you sear the meat, it's when you are going to then take the meat into the oven. Now, when you take a piece of fillet or steak and you just automatically just put it into the oven, you will not get that lovely brown outer layer. So you would sear the meat, where you quickly fry it in oil, just to create that layer of golden brownness, and then you can finish cooking it off in the oven. Stuffing is when you are adding force meat into the meat. You would always stuff a boneless piece of meat, so they must be you must debone it first, remove the bone, and then add any mixture that you would like. You can actually stuff meat with whatever you'd like, but there will always be like a carbohydrates, like you'll have your breadcrumbs and your eggs, and you bind it with the eggs, and you add your spices and your herbs, and then you would roll it, and then you would then still sear it, so you create the brown outer layer, and then you add it into the oven to cook. Trimming, this is when you remove any sinew and you remove any fat from the meat using a knife. It also just neatens the edges of the meat as well. Binding, you would bind meats that you've stuffed so that you can keep all the goodness inside the meat, and you would bind it using a string. Okay, cooking method. Just as you've discussed in grade 10, you've got your dry heat cooking methods, you've got your moist heat cooking methods, as well as your combination cooking methods. This is when you combine your dry and your moist heat. For example, I'm just going to check if we can. So for example, your combination cooking methods will be your braising and your pot roasting. So with your braising, what you then do is that you would first fry off the meat, and then you would add your liquid, and then you braise it. When you are pot roasting it, it is when you've added the liquids and your vegetables and your spices, and the meat cooks and becomes tender. It loses all the liquids, and then it starts to fry itself. Okay, so that you're combining the dry and the moist heat. Obviously, your drying will be your grilling, your oven roasting, your pan frying, when you're pan frying your meat, and then your moist heat is all the stewing, the steaming, the boiling of the meat. Now, what is the effect of heat? Now, with meat, you can either, when you are dry, when you apply dry heat cooking methods, especially to a piece of steak, you would or a piece of fillet, you would either cook the meat to be rare, medium, or well done. That is all to the specifications of the guest. People like their meat to be done in certain ways. And then what's important here as well is the effect on heat on the collagen and the elastin. Collagen is your white connective tissue which converts to gelatin when cooked, and that is normally that jelly-like layer that you'd find, especially when you are boiling or the meats. That jelly-like substance that you find at the bottom of the pan, that is your collagen. And then your elastin is your yellow connective tissue which does not break down. No matter how many hours you can cook or you can boil that piece of neck or whatever cut of meat that you are busy boiling, it will not disintegrate. Okay, that is elastin. So your collagen becomes soft, and then your elastin does not break down. Okay, now we're going to look at the animal carcass. Okay, I'm going to start off with the beef. Now, boys and girls, this is quite a very difficult part of meat, and a lot of learners they don't fare well in this section. Now, what I can advise you here is that you need to know first of all where the carcass or where that cut of meat comes from. Does it come from the hind quarter, or does it come from the forequarter? What is important for you to know is that meat that comes from the forequarter always needs your moist heat cooking methods, because they are naturally the more tougher cuts of meat. And meat that comes from the hind quarter needs the much more dry heat cooking methods, because they are much more tender. They can pose this question in many ways, this section in many ways. They can either give you the full carcass, and they can say identify what is number 8, for example. So you need to know number 8 is the prime rib, and then they can ask you what cooking methods or examples of dishes that you can get from the prime rib. Or they can give you the hind quarter on its own, and then they can say what would you find at number 13, what would you find at number 14, And then you would have to say, for example, at number 13 you've got your fillet, and then at number 14 you've got your top side, and then you must give them what cooking methods. Now you cannot say dry heat or moist heat cooking methods. You need to be specific, boys and girls. If it is dry heat, you need to specifically say, are you grilling it, are you roasting it, are you frying it? If it is moist heat, you need to be also specific there to say, are you stewing the meat? Are you pot roasting it? Are you braising it, etc.? Or are you boiling it, etc., etc.? Or alternatively, the examiners might give you an example of a cut. Let me now try and find one. Let's say they give you a piece of hump, and then they can now ask you, they will never ask you to identify, uh, for example, what it is, but they will tell you, maybe, for example, it is a hump, and then you must also now still give the cooking methods and tell us the use. Or they might even turn it around and tell you that this type of meat needs to be marinated, define marinating. Or they will tell you this piece of meat has to be deboned, give the advantages of deboning. Or they might tell you that this piece of meat, while you are roasting it in the oven, for example, you need to baste it. They will ask you what are the benefits of basting, or what ingredients are used in basting. So it is quite an application section where you need to apply the knowledge that you've learned into that particular cut you will be posed with at that particular time. Yes, the same with lamb. They will do the same. The different uses of meat. Here I've got you a piece of fillet. Okay, can you see all the marbling, the intramuscular fat? There is no bone here, so it'll definitely be your dry heat cooking methods, your grilling or pan frying. And then also, if you need to integrate it with your pastry, you can use a fillet when you are making a beef Wellington. And if you need to further integrate it into cocktail functions, you will then also mention that you can make mini beef Wellingtons with fillet, or you can also you can use it in kebabs. Okay, and then you've got your rump here, and then you might be posed with a question about the fattiness, the layers, and also the intramuscular fat. Connective tissue might come into play here, where they ask you the effect of heat when you're cooking this piece of rump. Your T-bone, you can see all the marbling there. Beautiful, beautiful marbling. This kind of meat cut, they can pose a question on. Maybe they can ask you about the serving portions, because remember, now they're trying to trick you, because you must now remember that once there's bone, so it'll have more weight. So they can ask you, what is the portion size of the T-bone steak? Or they might not even tell you it's a T-bone steak, and they'll ask you what is the portion size of the above meat cut, and you'll be asked to comment on the marbling as well. You might even be asked about the different techniques or preparation methods. So you would obviously, for example, with this T-bone, you trim it to remove the bit of fat on it. You would obviously marinate it, and then if they further on asking about the cooking methods, you will then talk about the grilling as a cooking methods, or dry, or any example of the dry heat cooking methods. Your tornadoes also, they all come from the fillet, and the medallions also come from the fillet. Okay, here you got your porterhouse steak. They can give you different types of steak, and each and every steak can have its own question. You just need to not only know what the whole carcass looks like, but you also need to know the different products or the different cuts from the carcass and what they look like. Hence, I've put the pictures up. Don't be alarmed, boys and girls. This will be available to you to download as well. Okay, this is your club steak. And then this is now your noisette. If you can see, they might ask you about the preparation method, which is your binding, and you cannot bind the meat, remember, unless it has been deboned. And deboning means that it is a removing of the bone. It stretches the meat so you can feed more people because you're not cutting against the bone. It also improves the appearance of the meat. You can further stuff it, and once you've stuffed it, it also improves the nutritional value of the meat. So that can also have quite a few components, or it can be asked in many different ways. Okay, you've got your kebabs here, and then you've got your crown roast, which comes from the lamb. Very, very important. Now, there's specific meat cuts that can be stewed, that can be braised, or can be minced. And you know that mincing and braising is your combination, stewing is your moist heat, and then mincing is basically taking, like, you can even take a steak and you can mince it and make it into mincemeat, and you can use the mincemeat if you can integrate that with your cocktail functions into little koftas, or you can use them into making mince balls, etc., etc. Portion sizes, very, very important. I made the example with the T-bone steak on the previous slides, and I mentioned that when meat is on the bone, it has got different grams that you serve. The portion sizes will be different because of the bone. Now, if it is off the bone, if you've deboned and removed the bone, each person should get between 120 and 150 grams. And if it is on the bone, it'll be 200 to 250 grams because the other weight belongs to the bone. Okay, an example, you've got your lamb shank there, and off the bone, you've got your fillet. Okay, once you are serving the meat, you've got your different accompaniments. And your first accompaniments can be gravy, and this is very good for roast beef, for roast lamb, for roast pork, for liver. Your mint sauce for your roast lamb and mutton. Apple jelly for your roast lamb. Um, and then also you've got your apple jelly here, apple sauce. The accompaniments are very, very important, learners, because if, for example, they give you that T-bone steak, like I mentioned before, or that meat roll that I mentioned before that has got the binding and is deboned, and it is a piece of lamb or it is a piece of beef, and they'll ask you what accompaniments. So you need to know each one. And then for your roast pork, it's your apple sauce, and then also for the pork, it's your red currant jelly, your marula jelly, your quince. Sorry, for your game meat. You also have your Yorkshire pudding, which accompanies roast beef. Your tongue is with your raisin sauce, and the yes, that's the end of our lesson, boys and girls. I hope you have learned quite a bit. Um, like I mentioned before, you will get questions, worksheets that will be uploaded to go along with this lesson on the ECDOE website. And I'll see you again next time when we deal with choux pastry. Yes, it's choux pastry. Thank you so much. Bye.